Okay, so today we're going to look at video compression. I think video compression, the way it's done, is one of the cleverest things I've seen. I'm very annoyed I didn't invent it. It's very, very clever how it all works. You recall at one stage I showed you a slide that had reduce, reuse, recycle, and it's saying one of the first things you can do to reduce the amount of data something is taking up is just reduce the amount of information in there. And then the next thing you can do is you can like reuse. And so we've seen some algorithms that reuse data. And then only as a final step do you need to actually recycle, so to speak. Video compression is one of those areas where the reuse is very, very clever and gets done an awful lot. Okay. Now, for our purposes, we need to think of video as a sequence of frames, one after the other. To create the illusion of motion, you need about 12 frames per second. Anything less, and it just looks like a bunch of images one after the other. The analog television system we used to use kind of did 25 frames per second. It actually did something more complicated than that. It did 50 half frames a second, but I'll explain that another time. I don't think we'll do that right now. And cinema uses 24 frames per second. So sometimes if you're going from cinema to putting something on TV, there was that extra frame that had to be accounted for and stuff. A lot of animation uses only 12 frames per second. Or if it was on film, what they would do is they would take the same picture twice. So they'd use 2 frames and then move the characters along or whatever. So when you see claymation, it has that sort of, there's kind of a strange kind of emotion. What you're noticing is perhaps that it's not actually 24 frames per second. It's less than that, and that's kind of what you're seeing. So depending on what you're doing, and we might try some of this in the labs even, I'm hoping to get you some video to code, to compress. Depending on what you're coding, you might use 12 frames per second instead of 24. So when I rip my kids' cartoons so they can watch them on the iPad, I very often don't do 24 frames a second, I do 12, because you wouldn't notice the difference anyway, and you know, does Spider-Man really need to be moving at 24 frames a second? Now, one of the problems with video is that it's very big. So if you take something of even very modest proportions, so if you wanted to watch an episode of one of your TV shows, 640 by 480 is probably as low as you could go in terms of dimensions in the screen without it being really shabby. Like you could enjoy 640 by 480. Anything less than that would be tough going. The screen you're looking at now, I think, is about slightly less than twice that. So it's the screen you're looking at now is about 800 by 1000. 640 by 480 anyway is really bottom of the range. Your phone would do better than that. At 25 frames a second and then at 24 bits per pixel, you're looking at something like 21 megabytes per second. So that's a big problem. So in the early days, it was a really big problem because you didn't even have systems that could handle that kind of data transfer. I mean, now, if you were trying to move 21 megabytes per second around, you could probably do it. So if I had a disk here that had a load of uncompressed video and I needed to get 21 megabytes per second off that disk into my machine and onto the screen, I could probably pull that off. But that's only a recent phenomenon. I mean, in the early days, you know, you couldn't even move that stuff around. It was just, you couldn't even do anything with it. It was so big. Okay, so now it's just expensive to store it. without being compressed. And it's expensive to transmit it without being compressed. So, I mean, if you were downloading 21 megabytes per second on your phone, for example, you wouldn't be long cranking up a nice big phone bill. You wouldn't be long using up your data allowance with that. Okay. We come at video compression then from two angles. So we have intra-frame compression and inter-frame compression. So intra means within and inter means between. So like intra-class dating would be you dating someone within the class. I know it's slim pickings here looking today at you guys, but and inter-class dating then would be between classes. Okay, and we talk about intra-frame compression and inter-frame compression. So with intra-frame compression, we're looking at it frame by frame. So you're looking at a frame of video and you say, okay, let's compress that frame. And then you're looking at the next frame. You say, okay, let's compress that frame. And then we're looking at the next frame and we compress that frame. So you could imagine a sequence of video that's 25 frames per second looking a lot like 25 JPEGs a second. So here's one compressed image, here's another compressed image, here's another compressed image, and here's another compressed image. And that's one approach. And we can do just that and have quite a lot of success. I mean, if your typical JPEG is going to be a third of the original size, then, you know, 10,000 JPEGs instead of 10,000 still images is going to be a third of the size. Where video compression really comes into its own is where we exploit the similarity between the frames. So we don't just look at one frame and then look at the next frame. We take a bunch of frames together and exploit the fact that there's quite a lot of similarity between them. And so that's where we get some really clever stuff going on. So intra-frame compression, everything basically single frame, pretty much like a JPEG. If you were sitting on the data stream looking at what's going on, you'd be forgiven for thinking there's a bunch of JPEGs flying past here. And there is even a quasi format we call MJPEG or motion JPEG, where basically you have a bunch of JPEGs one after the other. We use motion JPEG when you're editing, you know. So if you record your video and then you're going to be editing it, you'll see later why you don't want to have it thoroughly compressed before you edit it. So if we look here at Anne Doyle, so this is a screenshot of the news, and then this is a screenshot of the news quite some time later, you know, perhaps a second or two later, however long it took me to do Control-Alt capture screen again. So easily a second or two later. And you can see there that the main feature of this is that not a lot has happened between one frame and the next. There's very little change between one frame and the next. Now, surprisingly up here there's some change which I don't get. There's a little bit of motion up there. I don't know what that's about. Perhaps though, I don't know, maybe they were moving cars or something, I don't know. So, if these are, say, a second apart, you can imagine in a 25th of a second just how little has changed. You'd hardly even be able to see how much has changed. What I've done here is I've gone into Photoshop and I've used the difference, so you can see the difference between the two images, and they're highlighted here. So she's moving around a bit, you know, but the background has barely changed. Her, you know, clothing has barely changed. So interframe compression exploits the fact that very little actually changes between one frame and the next. So if we have frame 1, we have the next frame, and the next frame, and the next frame. Obviously this is a contrived example, but you can see that very little is changing between one frame and the next. If we look here, what we can do is we can construct the current frame by reusing parts of the previous frame and recycling them. If we look here, for example, in the blue area there, that's the only part that's changed. Sorry, as he points at the screen with his finger instead of the cursor. So this part here has changed between one frame and the next, but the house has stayed the same. Now obviously this is a contrived example, but you can see that maybe there, that's like maybe, I don't know, 1/5 or 1/6 of the image, and the rest is the same. And so what interframe compression does is it exploits this fact. It says, well, if the receiver already has frame 1, so I've sent frame 1 is there now. I can say, the transmitter can say to the receiver, look, frame 2 is the same as frame 1, you just need to change these parts here. So frame 2 is the same as frame 1, but with these changes. And this brings me back to the time we talked about difference coding, where you have values that are very similar from one to the next. And so you don't code the actual values, just the difference between the current one and the previous one. And this is this writ large. So if all you have to do is send the parts that have changed, then you can save a lot. I remember when I first learned about this, I was like, oh my god, that is so clever. I was blown away. So we're saying like frame 2 is the same as frame 1, except for these small changes. Frame 3 is the same as frame 2, except for these small changes. Frame 4 is the same as frame 3, except for these small changes. And remember, at the scale of a 50th of a second, those changes are pretty small. Okay? And so coding the difference between frames requires a lot less data than coding the frames one at a time. Now, it turns out though that if you were to address individual pixels, so like if we were to go back to this image here and say, okay, you know, maybe only 10% of the pixels in this image have changed. So you might say, okay, frame 2 is the same as frame 1, except this pixel here now has an RGB value of whatever, and this pixel here, and then this pixel here. To address the individual pixels in an image would take so many bits that it's not worth your while. You'd spend longer talking about the location of the pixel than you would describing what's in there. So typically what happens, or invariably what happens, is the image is broken up into blocks. And so you look at it block by block. So addressing an individual block then doesn't take as many bits. And so you split the image up, and you take the current frame and you split it up into blocks, and you compare each block with its corresponding block in the previous frame. And you'd say, okay, is it the same or is it different? And you might even have a threshold. So if it's, you know, almost the same, you might say, okay, well, we won't bother resending that so. If it's completely different, we just say, okay, this block is not the same as the one in the previous frame, so here it is. If it's close enough, and you'll have some measure, and if it's close enough, you'll say, oh, well, this block is the same as the block in the previous frame, so just reuse that. And so you'd be the transmitter would be keeping track. So if it's using a block from, say, you know, 4 frames ago, by the time, you know, it gets to the 5th one, it might say, okay, now it's different enough. I'm going to send it now. It has changed. Sometimes when the video compression is turned up too high, the quality is too low, you kind of start to see that. I may ruin your viewing pleasure, but once you understand how video compression works, you can't not see it anymore. And you start to see the blocks. You know, there's an explosion on the screen and you see all the blocks. If it's coded really poorly, you start to notice actually that, you know, this part of a person's face has moved, but this part hasn't, because this block here was just similar enough to not change. But, you know, the person's face isn't all moving together. You start to see all these things, particularly when the quality is very poor. So blocks that are significantly different from the previous frame to this frame get transmitted. Blocks that don't change, they just get copied and pasted. So the instructions from the transmitter to the receiver might be something like, block 1 is no change, block 2 no change, block 3 no change, block 4 no change, block 5 no change. Here's block 6, here's block 7, here's block 8, block 9 no change, block 10 no change, block 11 no change, here's block 12, block 13 no change. Something like that. It does cause problems where the boundaries of objects span across blocks, and you get to see sometimes at the edges. So not unlike the problems you see with JPEG, sometimes the blocks become evident if things don't go well. But for the most part, it works fine. The scope for reusing is huge, and again, this is all happening at, you know, 1/25th of a second. So if one of the frames sucks a little bit, well, you know, it'll be gone before you can actually even see it. Okay? Now, this is where it starts to get really clever. Any questions on that much so far? So you're reusing blocks from before. So it's a bit like just copy and paste. Someone gives you, you know, frame 1. Then you say, okay, I want you to make frame 2 now, and they give you a scissors, and you can cut out the bits of frame 1. You know, and then the new pieces you need from frame 2 you can just stick down, whatever. So it's a copy and paste job. Now look here at the current frame on the right there. The fourth last block is that piece of the wheel there. So let's say we're trying to code this block here. Okay? We compare this with the equivalence block in the previous frame, and we see that it's very different. So like, this block is the same as this block. 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 Like, this block is the same as this block, so no problems there. But here, this block is very different from this block. So not a lot to be done there, you might think. But if we look around, you can see that the information that we need to construct this block is in fact in the previous frame. It's just moved. So the thing we're looking for, the block we're looking for in order to construct the current frame, is in fact in the previous frame. It's just not where we were expecting it. It moved a bit. And so this is a really clever element of video compression algorithms, is that modern algorithms not only reuse the blocks that haven't moved, but even if the block moves, it can figure out, okay, that was there though, it's just moved, so I'm going to copy and paste that. So in motion compensated video, we call it, the compression algorithm searches around the area of the block in the previous frame to see if what it's looking for is there. And so it can reuse it even if it's moved. Which is really, really clever, because if you think about what happens in a video, I mean, the background is probably unchanged, so you can reuse those parts. The only thing that's changing typically is stuff that's moving. But if you can reuse the pixels, reuse the blocks, even if they've moved, well, then you've really got an awful lot of data that you can reuse over and over again. Now, it doesn't, I mean, there are scenarios where it breaks down, obviously, and we'll look at some of those. So it assumes, I mean, this in theory will only work under certain circumstances. So it assumes that objects move in a plane that's parallel to the camera plane. So it assumes that everybody's walking around like in South Park. Do you know what I mean? So South Park is a best case scenario for this, because you don't really have, you know, even when the things are moving, they're moving in a plane. Okay? Now if something is rotating, so if I'm in a street fight, you know, it's hard to make the front of my head out of the back of my head. You know. Now, of course, in reality, this is all happening at 1/25th of a second. So, you know, how different is my face now and 1/25th of a second, even if I am rotating? You know, zooming in and out doesn't work either. Okay. Another problem is if the illumination changes. So if I'm standing under a street light in one frame and then I walk into the dark, or if we say do the reverse, if I'm standing in the dark and then I walk into a street light, under a street light, it's going to be hard to construct the image of me under the street light from the image of me in the dark. Similarly, if you've got like strobe lights or disco lights, you know, a lot of things will change from one frame to the next. So if the illumination changes within the image, spatially, or temporally, like between the frames over time, it kind of breaks down there. And then of course, if one object is in front of another, that's going to cause a problem. So if I pull a rabbit out of a hat, you know, it's going to be very hard to construct the rabbit from just the hat in the previous frame. But like I said, this is happening at 1/25th of a second. So a lot of the time, even when these problems occur, you still get some scope for reuse in the very, very short term. Any questions? Because it gets hairier. No. So MPEG, Motion Picture Experts Group, is an ISO standard for compressing video. Following on the success of JPEG, a lot of the same people who were involved actually decided, okay, if JPEG was such a success, maybe we can come up with a scheme for coding video that'll be standardized, and we'll see many of the economies of scale and things that we saw with JPEG. And actually, of course, it was a huge success. So in MPEG, the frames coded using intra-frame compression are called I-frames, and then the frames coded with interframe compression are called predicted frames, or P-frames. And so here, for example, frame 1 is an I-frame, and then frame 2 is a P-frame. So frame 2 is reusing parts of frame 1. Frame 3 is a P-frame, and it's reusing parts of frame 2. And frame 4 is a P-frame, and it's reusing parts of frame 3. So you can see there are these dependencies. So every so often then you have to start off all over again. Like you can't keep doing this for, you know, a whole movie. For starters, we have new scenes. You know, so, you know, you're looking at good cop, looking at bad cop, good cop, bad cop, good cop, bad cop. I mean, you don't try and make the good cop's face out of the bad cop's face. When you have a scene change, you just start again. And so compression algorithms might be looking for scenarios where there is a scene change. And they go, okay, you know, all bets are off now. I know video compression is great, but I just have to start again here with a new iframe. Generally, the pattern is quite systematic. So if you get some compressed video and you look at it, you know, the ratio of iframes to p-frames in the pattern, you know, it might start every 12 frames. It might, you know, do a new iframe or whatever. Okay, So it tends not to be terribly adaptive to the content. It just, you know, flakes away. Any questions? Okay, so the plot thickens now. So here with frame 1. Frame 2 is made up by recycling parts of frame 1. Frame 3 is made using parts of frame 2. And frame 4 is made using parts of frame 3. And then frame 5, we start again with an I-frame. Then frame 6 is a P-frame made from parts of 5. 7 is a P-frame made from parts of 6. And like I said, 8 is a P-frame made from parts of 7, and so on. No. That's where it gets even cleverer. Just when you thought it couldn't get any better. Or worse, depending on your point of view. Let's have a look here at frame 1. And we're looking at frame 2. And we see here that we want to make frame 2 out of frame 1. Now, the motion here has caused a problem. The tree in the background hasn't changed, so those blocks up there would be fine. Nothing has changed here. Even if we were trying to code the car, we might be able to account for the fact that, okay, it's not what we were expecting it to be. Some of it's moved, but it's still in there, it's just moved. We could maybe find it. But this block here, like, it's not a question of looking really, really hard for this block in frame 2, in frame 1. It's just not there. It's behind that car and it's just not there. You can search high and low and you won't find this grass in frame 1. So you might think, okay, that's a pity. We were doing great, but you know, what can we do? It's just not there. Well, the thing is though, it is in frame 3, isn't it? So we can't find, we were trying to construct frame 2 and the information we're looking for isn't in frame 1. But lo, behold, there it is in frame 3 waiting to be plucked. So if we had a system that allowed for data to be copied from future frames as well as past frames, you'd imagine it could be quite successful. And so that's what MPEG does. It allows for bidirectional prediction, it's called, or B-frames. So here, frame 2 is made by reusing parts of frame 1 and parts of frame 3. So we have a past frame and a future frame involved there in the construction of the current frame. Which is a bit of a head wreck. This creates then some strange dependencies. So here we have an I-frame in frame 1, and then frame 2 is a B-frame that uses parts of frame 1 and parts of frame 4. Frame 3 is a B-frame that uses parts of frame 1 and parts of frame 4. Now the quality of B-frames is quite poor relative to P-frames and I-frames, but the size is very small. But we don't allow B-frames to use other B-frames as their reference because the quality is poor, so you'd be copying, you know, it just gets shabby. So I-frames are standalone frames. P-frames use a previous I-frame or a previous P-frame. And then B-frames use one past I or P-frame and one future I or P-frame, but never another B-frame. Here we have 4, which is a P-frame, which is reusing parts of frame 1. Next up we have 5, which reuses parts of frame 4 and 7. Frame 6 is reusing parts of frame 4 and parts of frame 7. And then frame 7 is a P frame. And so it goes on like this then. So you'll have an I frame, some B's, P's, B's, P's, B's, P's, and eventually then you start all over again. And so there's quite a lot of variation here, quite a lot of things you can set. So the number of, you know, how frequently you have your iframes is going to have an impact on the video quality and size. How the gap between your P frames, you know, is going to have an impact. So all of these things that you can set when you're coding. No, and so on. So you can't talk about JPEG, sorry, you can't talk about MPEG without talking about these dependencies. If you look up MPEG in a book, you'll eventually come across a diagram that looks pretty much like this. So because the dependencies between the I frames, the P frames, and the B frames are the key to that. Let's have a look now at how this might look if you're the transmitter and you're transmitting this sequence. And this now is really where people's heads start to explode. So we transmit frame 1, it's standalone frame, no problems there. Next up we transmit frame 2, but hang on a minute, like how can the receiver display frame 2? Frame 2 is made by recycling parts of frame 1 and parts of frame 4. But it doesn't have 4. So what has to happen, and this is where people go, you're kidding me, kill me now. We have to send 4 first. So we send frame 1, then we send frame 4, then we send frame 2. And now the receiver knows, well, frame 2 is constructed by using parts of frame 1 and parts of frame 4. Grant, that's something I can deal with. I have 1, I have 4. I'm good to go. Then we send frame 3, uses parts of frame 1, parts of frame 4. What do you think happens next? 7. We send 7. Next we send frame 7, because frame 7 is made by recycling parts of frame 4. Frame 5 uses some blocks from frame 4 and some blocks from frame 7. But the receiver has set 4 and 7, so it's good to go. And 6, and so on. So the frames end up being transmitted in an order different from the order of display. Which is one of those, oh my God, moments. You're like, how did my life get so complicated?
But that would be like milliseconds, you wouldn't even notice it, would you?
Well, that's the thing. If this is live, it's probably live, but maybe 12/25ths of a second delayed. So if you're watching digital video live, there's necessarily some sort of delay, albeit, you know, a few frames. Could be maybe 6 frames late, which could represent, I don't know, a quarter of a second. You know? You can see too how figuring out all this, you know, should I use this block here, should I use this block here, that's quite complicated. So compressing video live is actually a very big ask. There was a time it was too big an ask, it was impossible. You couldn't get computers that were fast enough to do all that. You can now, in fairness. But we still, when we're compressing video, like to take our sweet time about it and to have a think. The algorithm, you know, looks at this, looks at that. Should I go for that block there now? Should I go for that block? Which of these would be better? Or which would be optimal? And that brings to the question of asymmetry. Video compression is vastly more complex. Video is vastly more complex to compress than to decompress. So if you're decompressing video, if you're watching it, well, you certainly have to compress it at least as fast as real time so that you can see it smoothly. You know, if it took more than a second to decompress a second's worth of video, well, you know, you couldn't watch it. But it can take longer than a second to compress a second's worth of video. It doesn't really matter as long as you can watch it later. It doesn't matter how long it takes to play it. You know, it's a bit like burning a CD. You can burn this, 72 minutes of music in, 15 minutes. But actually it wouldn't matter if it took, 172 minutes to burn a CD of 72 minutes of music, as long as you could play it back. So video compression is what we call it asymmetrical. It's more complex to compress than decompress. And in the next class we'll see precisely why that is. But in a way it makes sense that you would do it that way. Like if the scope for making one part more complex in order to make the other part less complex, that's the way you'd go about it. So like the RTEs and BBCs and YouTubes of this world, they handle the complex task of compression, and by shifting the burden to the compression side of the equation, you can make the decoders simpler. So, RTE has complex hardware, but the little thing that sits on your TV is simple. So that makes economic sense as well, but it mostly comes from the way the algorithms work. Now, there's an issue then with noise as well then. So if you lose something, what happens? So let's say frame 4 here gets killed off. So it's a packet that just gets lost, or it's a bird that flies into your satellite dish. Something happens. Okay? That frame 4 there was used in the construction of frame 2. So frame 2 is screwed now as well. That frame was also used in the construction of frame 3. So, whoop, there goes frame 3. That's no good now either. Similarly, this P frame here relied on frame 4. So that's banjaxed now too. As are the intermediate B frames. So whereas in the past, if you lost the equivalent of 1/25 of a second's worth of data, you lost just that and only that. Because there are so many dependencies in MPEG frames, if you lose one frame, you lose all of the frames that are dependent on that as well. So it's not very robust when it comes to loss, which is another reason why we start every so often. So if you have a new iframe, 2 a second, okay, you've lost half a second there. The picture's gone for half a second. It's annoying, but it came back. And so on. So that's a problem we have with digital video. It's so compressed, it's so efficient that we can't really afford to lose any of it and get away with it for very long. Okay? Any questions on that? So that's a tough one. It's probably one of the cleverest things you'll see in a long time. It's also quite complex though. But in a way it makes complete sense though as well. And so that's how we're able now to have things like YouTube, fit what seem to be huge amounts of video down a small pipe. How you can get many channels, with the same bandwidth you had before. And so digital television works like this. Okay, any questions?